located to the nucleus. So again, lending support that the chloroplast was its own prokaryotic cell. And this was thought to have occurred after the mitochondria moved into the eukaryotic cells, because all of your photosynthetic cells also have mitochondria, but it's not the other way around. All of your eukaryotic cells do not have a chloroplast, but they do all have a mitochondria. So that again supports that this happened first. So again, backing this theory up, again we have the mitochondria of the chloroplast have their own ribosomes. Those ribosomes are actually closer to bacterial ribosomes. They can both do protein synthesis, and they both have their own DNA, which is similar to bacterial DNA. So again, supporting that they used to be a prokaryote. The fact that they have their own DNA and their own ribosomes, which again are closer to bacterial DNA and ribosomes, and that they can do protein synthesis, which bacterial cells are also able to do protein synthesis. So this is where the ring of life would come from then, as opposed to a straight phylogenetic tree like we saw on one of the other slides. The fact that eukaryotic cells have genes from a common ancestor that gave rise to both RK and Eukarya, and they have genes from the bacterial domain due to endosymbiosis, that these all have contributed then to the Eukarya domain. So our single-celled eukaryotes, as we follow them, we can see them forming here around 2.7 billion years ago, on the time scale. Again, we had the ancestral prokaryote, we had the compartmentalization and the folding, the incorporation of the mitochondria, followed eventually by the incorporation of the plastid. Eukaryotic cells also produce lipids, and lipids are what are considered a biomarker for eukaryotic cells. And a biomarker is a compound that's only made by a particular type of cell. So prokaryotes do not make lipids, only eukaryotic cells do. And so when we started seeing the appearance of lipids, that also is another indicator of eukaryotic evolution. The next step in eukaryotic evolution was sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is very important because this is where we get our genetic variety, the variability and the ability to exchange genetic material. Just like, think on the scale of humans, right? You are not exactly the same as one of your parents. You're not a clone. You're a mix of the two. And that variety is important. Just like we talked about on your lab with your variation in that question about human hands and why it would be important for them to be different sizes. Okay, so variety again adds stability. Okay, and so the beginning of sexual reproduction helped ensure this genetic variety, okay, which allowed for these new combinations of genes, which allowed for evolution to occur even faster because of this. So it wasn't necessarily a source of new genes, but it was a source of new combinations of genes. Mutations is the only way we can get new genes. But this allowed for new combinations of genes, which could allow for new phenotypes. And new phenotypes means that there could be one now that is better suited for the environment. After sexual reproduction, then, we started to see the evolution of multicellular eukaryotes. The oldest known multicellular species is about 1.2 billion years ago. So it took a long time for multicellular eukaryotes to come along. Okay? By about 900 million years ago, that's what the MYA is, you had algae, fungi, animals. All of these things had evolved in the sea. The issue here with your multicellular organisms is that required coordination between the cells. Cells had to start to specialize for a multicellular organism. They had to start coordinating their activities, okay? And so your larger, much more diverse multicellular organisms didn't appear until 565 million years ago. A few minutes ago, we were talking 2.7 billion years ago. Okay? It was a long, slow process, okay? And a lot of that was due to the land masses, the seas. They were covered in ice, okay? And so that made it difficult for them to form. So most of the living organisms most of the animals Okay, at first we had soft bodies. They were herbivores, they were scavengers, they were filter feeders. We didn't have large carnivores. We didn't have, tertiary consumers. Again, we're talking soft bodies, herbivores, scavengers, or filter feeders. And then we had what's called the Cambrian Explosion occurred. Okay, and it's considered an explosion, and I use that term loosely, okay, because in geological time, this was a very rapid period of time, 10 million years. Again, we had been talking billions of years, millions of years. Okay, so 10 million years was relatively quickly. We had this explosion happen, and what we had here is this huge variety of animals appeared due to this explosion. We got exoskeletons, spines, okay, so vertebrates, because they were invertebrates before, body armor. We got carnivores with claws and their ability to capture prey. We also started to see the colonization of land. Organisms started to move onto land about 500 million years ago. We started seeing a lot of adaptations in plants so that plants were able to survive on land, such as the development of a vascular system. Plants had to develop that xylem and phloem that transports water to the various parts of the plant so that it could survive on land and didn't have to live in an aquatic environment. They had started to develop those cuticles to prevent them from drying out, the tissue like lignin that will help support them as they grow larger. Okay? So that started their ability to reproduce on land, period. Ferns, some of the older plants, they require a water source for the sperm to be able to travel. So you started seeing things like seeing the wind pollination and the other ability of the plants to be able to reproduce on land. And that was occurring about 420 million years ago. Okay? It was only 50 million years ago that we saw this huge diversification in plants. Fungi came onto land about the same time as plants. Structurally, they are simpler than animals or plants. Okay, remember, fungi, they are a heterotroph. They are not mobile. They do have a cell wall, though, but they're not doing photosynthesis like a plant. Okay, some animal adaptations that had to occur for animals to move on to plants is they also had to prevent dehydration. Needed some kind of support to support their weight. Okay, the development of a skeleton, basically, whether it was an exoskeleton or an endoskeleton, to support their weight while on gravity, against gravity on land, okay, as well as being able to successfully reproduce on land. Organisms that reproduce on land, like a lot of your fish, the female will lay eggs, and the male will come and fertilize those eggs at a later time, and that wouldn't work very well on land. Arthropods were the most successful. Arthropods includes bugs. So we got tons and tons of bugs, so they were very successful. Tetrapods came about on land about 365 million years ago. Tetraspores, these four-legged organisms here. Okay, your common ancestor for man and the chimpanzees didn't come about till about 6 or 7 million years ago, with Homo sapiens coming 195,000 years ago. So when we're talking geological time, this is very, very recent. Some of the things that were happening at Earth, in addition to having the changes in the atmosphere with the gas compositions, is that helped influence evolution, is the movement of the tectonic plates, which most of you guys are aware of. The Earth's crust, has several of the solid plates. You can see those in the diagram there on the right. And those plates, they sit on top of the magma, and the magma is molten, so it's liquid, and so they can slide around on this magma. And so this continental drift... This continental drift allowed allopatric speciation to occur on a very large scale. This separation of the organisms into a new species, this really allowed it to happen. Your dramatic change in the climate has happened due to these shiftings here. One of the examples would be in Labrador, Canada. Most of you hopefully know where Canada is. Doesn't matter if you know where Labrador, Canada is. It was once on the equator. And so the change between those two is about 40 degrees latitude. It took about 200 million years ago for it to move to where it is. But on the equator versus Canada now is an extremely different climate, which is going to influence the evolution of the organisms that live there. So over the course of this continental drift, we've seen the continents, come together as Pangea, and then they've come apart like they are now. So this is going to change climate, ocean currents. Lots of geological things are going to shift with this. These changes occur slowly, but it can still cause, sometimes it may cause speciation to occur, and sometimes it may cause mass extinctions to occur because the organisms just cannot adapt quickly enough to the changing environment and the changing climate that's happening. There were 5 major extinctions that happened. And when you consider a major extinction, we're talking 50% or more of all species were eliminated. So that includes animals, plants, 50% or more were eliminated, which is huge. Okay, so these were due to these shifts in the earth. One example of these mass extinctions is here, the Permian extinction. So the Permian extinction, about 251 million years ago in Serbia, which is in Europe, there was a collision of the continents, and so we had a large amount of volcanic eruptions happen at the time. The continents at the time were all as one. They were in Pangea, okay, and so in the region of Serbia, so in the region of Europe area, okay, this was all these volcanic eruptions occurred. And the thought was that we had so much ash happen that would block sunlight, which affected glacial formations, which affected the oceans. What happened here is 96% of the marine species and 70% of land species died out during this extinction. Another example would be the Cretaceous mass extinction. This one occurred about 65 million years ago. In this one, you had about 50% of your marine species and many families of your terrestrial species. This was not due to the continental drift. This was due to a meteorite colliding with the Earth, which caused tsunamis, lots of debris that rose into the atmosphere that spread around the Earth. Okay, this heated the atmosphere a lot. Okay, so we had significant amount of fires blocking the sun, which had a huge impact on the plant life. And a large impact on our producers, remember, has a large impact on our consumers. So not quite as extreme as the Permian, but still a large amount of species dying off. Another example is the Great Oxygen Catastrophe, and you don't need to know the ins and outs of all of these. You just need to be comfortable with some of these examples. So the Great Oxygen Catastrophe, so oxygen is produced by photosynthesis, as we mentioned, and it's started being produced about 2.4 billion years ago. And so at first, the oxygen levels remained pretty low because the oxygen was reacting with minerals like iron, things that could be oxidized. So as we had increases in the oxygen levels, these obligate anaerobes, these organisms that cannot tolerate oxygen at all, they started dying off. Okay, we reached very high oxygen levels that was killing off those organisms, and they started dying off. The larger plants were living in low swamplands, so as they died, they started to get buried in the swamp. They didn't decompose. That's eventually what became the source of coal. Okay, and those swamplands dried up. And as they dried up, oxygen production decreased. And so it decreased to levels that are... So these oxygen levels dropped dramatically. What happened with this great oxygen catastrophe is that about 250 million years ago, when about 90% of all the marine species were wiped out a huge portion of plant, animal, insect species on land. Okay, so the volcanoes that were happening, okay, that were thought to drive this, and then all the loss of these animals, we had a very huge drop in our oxygen levels. So originally our oxygen levels were growing. Okay, that was an issue for the obligate anaerobes. Okay, but then we had very high levels of oxygen, and then this dramatic drop off, which really slowed down the Earth's ability to replenish the land. So we have So we'll be working with some timelines in class and making sure we understand kind of the order all of these things happened in, okay, and the significance of some of these experiments and catastrophes.